She paid just $600 for a beat-up 1974 Dodge Challenger, rusted, lifeless, and hidden away in a dusty barn. Elena Morales, a U.S. Army veteran and mechanic, thought she was simply buying a personal project to keep her busy. But what she uncovered inside that car, a story of love, loss, and a father's buried grief, would transform her life in ways she never imagined. What started as a simple restoration turned into a mission of healing, legacy, and the kind of miracle you won't find in any manual. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if you love stories of hope, redemption, and second chances, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story will move you even deeper. Let's get started. The afternoon sun baked the cracked asphalt of Glenfield, a quiet southern town where dust lingered in the air like old memories, and cicadas screamed from pine trees that bent under the weight of late summer. Inside a one-bay garage at the edge of town, Elena Morales leaned against the dented doorframe, sweat dampening the collar of her orange mechanic's uniform, her dark hair tied back in a practical knot, her black boots coated in a thin sheen of dust and oil. She was 34, a veteran of the U.S. Army Infantry, a woman who had marched through blistering deserts and freezing highlands, whose discipline was carved by battle, and whose nights were still broken by the echoes of gunfire. In this town, she was no longer Sergeant Morales, no longer the squad leader responsible for lives, but simply Elena, a woman trying to keep a small garage alive while carrying in her ghosts with quiet dignity. Beside her, a German shepherd named Rex sat with regal stillness, his fur a rich blend of black and tan, his muzzle touched with gray that hinted at his 7 years of hard service. His amber eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the empty road with the wariness of a soldier who had seen too much. Rex had been trained as a canine partner in patrol and explosives detection, a dog that had once charged into hostile terrain with nothing but instinct and courage. A scar along his left flank, just under the harness strap, was a souvenir from shrapnel during a night raid years ago. Retirement hadn't dimmed his alertness. He was still her shadow, her second heartbeat. Elena often thought Rex was the only one who truly understood the silence that followed when duty ended and life became unbearably ordinary. Business had been slow for months. Cars in Glenfield rarely came in for full restorations. People patched what they could, drove until machines coughed their last, and then abandoned them in junkyards. Elena's garage wasn't thriving on profit. It was surviving on stubborn pride. Her late father, Miguel Morales, had been a mechanic who could bring any dead engine to life, and she had inherited not only his tools but his ethos. Machines deserved respect, even when humans didn't. On nights when loneliness pressed too heavily, she remembered being 10 years old, standing in this same garage handing her father a wrench far too large for her small hands, and the way he winked at her as though she were already his apprentice. That memory had kept her alive in war zones, and now it anchored her in peacetime. It was on such an afternoon that opportunity, or perhaps fate, came rumbling down her driveway. A flatbed truck, its paint peeling and exhaust coughing, pulled up with a heavy cargo chained in back. The driver, a broad man in his 50s with a sunburned neck and grease-streaked overalls, jumped down and gestured toward the load. Elena stepped forward, Rex padding at her side, ears twitching. The truck held a Dodge Challenger 1974, or at least what was left of one. Rust crawled like veins along the doors, the windshield was cracked in a jagged lightning pattern, and moss clung stubbornly around the trunk seam. One tire hung flat and defeated, the others bald from decades of stillness. It looked less like a car and more like a relic exhumed from the earth. "You sure you want this thing?" the driver asked, his voice half amusement, half disbelief. He wiped his forehead with a rag that left a darker smear instead of cleaning. His name, stitched into his pocket, read Carl. He was a local hauler, the type who'd seen every piece of junk that the hills could hide. Elena crossed her arms, her eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun. She saw not just rust and decay, but a silhouette of possibility, the lines of American muscle that had once thundered down highways in a blur of rebellion. Her lips curled into the faintest smile. $600, right? She said simply. Carl shrugged. "Lady, I wouldn't pay half that, but it's your funeral." She handed him the cash without hesitation. Money was tight, her savings were thin, the electricity in the garage was spotty, and sometimes she skipped meals to make sure Rex had his. But something about the Challenger struck her deeper than logic, like a heartbeat hidden under a broken rib cage. When Carl lowered the car into Bay 2, the old suspension groaned in protest. The smell of mildew and rust filled the garage, sharp enough to sting the eyes. Carl gave her a last incredulous shake of the head before climbing back into his truck. "Good luck, Morales. You'll need it." The truck roared away, leaving silence behind. Elena stood alone with the Challenger. The only sounds the ticking of hot metal cooling in the shade and the rhythmic pant of Rex at her side. She stepped forward slowly, gloved hand brushing the hood. The surface was rough, paint long surrendered to time, but the gesture was reverent, as if she were greeting a wounded comrade. In her mind, she didn't just see a car. She saw long nights overseas when engines of Humvees had to be patched under moonlight, when survival depended on mechanical precision. She saw her father, his knuckles bruised and blackened, leaning over carburetors on Sunday mornings. She saw herself, a girl with grease on her cheeks, dreaming of building something that was hers alone. Her voice was a whisper, almost to herself. "You've been asleep too long." Rex padded closer, lowering his head to sniff along the passenger side door. He lingered, nose pressed against the edge of the cracked vinyl seat visible through the window. His ears flicked and he gave a low, curious whine. Elena tilted her head. "What is it, boy?" The dog pawed gently at the base of the seat, then stepped back, his amber eyes fixed on her. Elena frowned, filing the reaction away. She trusted Rex's instincts as she once trusted him on patrol routes. If he sensed something inside, it wasn't random. The Challenger wasn't just metal and rust. It carried a story, one waiting to be uncovered. She exhaled slowly, the weight of the day pressing against her chest. The garage lights flickered overhead, buzzing weakly, as though echoing the car's silent challenge. Elena unzipped the top of her uniform slightly, letting the humid air cool her neck, and set down her tool bag. The first step would be cleaning, stripping away the years of neglect, uncovering what still had life beneath the corrosion. It would be grueling, consuming, and perhaps unprofitable. But as she looked at Rex and saw his ears perk in solidarity, she realized it didn't matter. This wasn't just about restoring a car, it was about restoring herself. The sun slid lower, painting the garage floor in orange slats of light. Elena crouched, studying the Challenger with the trained patience of a soldier scouting terrain. Her heart beat steady, purposeful. In this forgotten machine, she saw the outline of redemption. Rex leaned against her leg, silent and steady, as though to say they would face this together. And for the first time in many months, Elena felt not the heaviness of endings, but the faint spark of a beginning. 3 days had passed since the Challenger had rolled into Elena Morales's garage, and in that time the dust of the old car had seeped into every corner of her one-bay shop. She had stripped out at the rotten seats, set aside carpeting that smelled of mold, and bagged up mouse nests she had found in the glove box. Her arms ached from wrenching bolts frozen with rust. Her nails were blackened from grease, and her orange mechanic's uniform bore new stains that would never wash out. Yet, with each small victory, she felt a strange pulse of satisfaction, as though she was digging not only into metal, but into some hidden vein of purpose. Rex kept a steady watch, lying near the open bay door, amber eyes following her every move, his ears twitching whenever she muttered at a stubborn screw. The Challenger was no longer silent. Its disassembly filled the garage with the rhythm of clattering tools, like a heartbeat slowly coming back to life. On the fourth morning, just as Elena was tightening a bolt on the stripped dashboard, the bell above the garage door jingled, a sound rarely heard these days. Rex rose instantly, his posture stiff and protective, a low rumble in his throat as his gaze fixed on the figure entering. Elena straightened, pushing a strand of damp hair from her forehead, and looked up. The man who stepped inside was in his early 60s, tall and lean, but with a slight stoop in his shoulders, as though years of labor and heavier grief had bent him. His hair was mostly silver, cut short and tidy, and a trimmed mustache framed a mouth that carried the memory of many unsmiling years. His skin was weathered, tanned, and lined deeply at the corners of his eyes, marks of a man who had lived long under the southern sun. He wore a battered leather jacket zipped halfway, a faded plaid shirt beneath, and work boots that had seen decades of use. His hands were calloused, veins raised like ridges, the hands of someone who once knew engines but had long since put tools aside. His eyes, gray and somber, softened when they landed on the Challenger. "You bought her," he said, his voice low and gravelly, carrying a weight of something more than simple recognition. Elena stayed still, studying him. "I did. $600. She came in on a flatbed." The man nodded once, slowly. "Frank Doyle. That car, it belonged to my daughter." Rex let out a short bark, then settled, as if accepting the introduction. Elena wiped her palms on a rag, curiosity piqued. She motioned towards a stool near the wall. "You want to sit?" Frank waved the offer off, his gaze fixed on the car. She loved that thing, spent every spare dime she earned on parts, weekends in the garage with grease up to her elbows. Lily was her name. He paused, swallowing hard as though the word itself was heavy. 20 years back, she drove out one night after a shift. Roads were slick from rain. She didn't make it home. The silence that followed was thick. Elena felt it pressed down on her chest. She knew the look in his eyes. She had seen it in the families of soldiers who received folded flags, the eyes of those who had lost someone young, someone vibrant, to fate's cruel hand. Frank stepped closer to the Challenger, reaching out as if to touch it, but pulling his hand back at the last second. "I couldn't bring myself to sell it, not then. Just pushed it behind the barn, covered it up. For 20 years I couldn't look at it without seeing her face behind the wheel." His voice trembled, but then steadied with quiet resolve. "But I heard someone bought it. Thought I should see with my own eyes." Elena found herself softening, lowering her guard. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "She must have been someone special." Frank nodded. "She was fire and steel, not the sort of girl who stayed in the lines drawn for her, always tinkering, always racing boys twice her size and beating them half the time. She wanted to be a mechanic, maybe even open her own shop someday. She was 20 when she died. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a worn manila envelope, and handed it to Elena. She hesitated before taking it, sensing the weight of what it contained. "What's this?" Frank's expression softened with something between pride and sorrow. Pieces of her dream. Photos of her with the car, sketches of upgrades she planned, the bill of sale from 1974. I kept them. Couldn't throw them out. But I think... He paused, eyes meeting Elena's with a searching intensity. "I think maybe it's time those dreams go where they belong. Maybe you can carry them further than I could." Elena opened the flap and slid out a stack of faded photographs. In one, a young woman with dark hair tied back in a ponytail stood proudly next to the Challenger when its paint still gleamed red. Her face was bright with mischief, grease streaking her cheek like a badge of honor. Other photos showed her under the hood, hands stained with oil, laughing at something off camera. There were hand-drawn diagrams of suspension setups, lists of parts with prices scribbled in the margins, and the original sales receipt with Lily's name written in neat cursive. The images pulled at Elena's chest. She saw in Lily a mirror of herself, a girl who found freedom in machines, who felt engines spoke louder than words. She glanced at Frank, who stood stiffly as if bracing for judgment. "She had vision," Elena said, her voice low but steady. "She knew what she wanted." Frank exhaled, a sound like something breaking loose inside. "I want to know if you can make it live again. I don't need it for myself. I don't want to drive it. But if you can bring it back, if you can give it the life she wanted for it." His throat closed for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was almost a whisper. "Then maybe she won't be forgotten." Elena set the envelope down gently, her hand brushing the rough surface. She looked at Rex, who had settled again at her feet, ears perked, head resting on his paws as though waiting for her to answer. She thought of the many times she had seen men in combat cling to mementos of their loved ones as though objects could anchor memory against oblivion. Perhaps they could. Perhaps this car was more than metal and rust. It was the vessel of a story that still needed to be told. "I'll do it justice," Elena said finally, her voice carrying the firmness of a vow. "I can't promise miracles, but I'll do everything I can." Frank's eyes glistened, though he did not let the tears fall. He extended his hand. Elena grasped it firmly, the handshake of two people who had both lived with loss. His palm was rough, but the grip strong. After a long moment, Frank turned toward the door. "I'll stop by again, not to hover, not to judge, just to see her alive again." He paused, glancing back at Elena. "Thank you, Morales. You didn't know her, but you're giving me something I thought I lost." When he was gone, Elena sat heavily on the stool, staring at the photos spread across her workbench. Rex lifted his head, watching her with quiet understanding. She reached down, scratched behind his ears, and whispered, "Looks like we've got company on this journey, boy." The garage was silent again, except for the ticking of the Challenger cooling in the shade. But to Elena, it no longer felt like silence. It felt like the echo of a young woman's laughter carried across time, urging her forward. The morning light slanted across the garage floor, highlighting the layers of dust that Elena Morales had yet to sweep away. She had been working late the previous night, sorting through the stack of photographs Frank Doyle had left her. The smiling face of Lily, her grease-stained cheeks, the sparkle in her eyes as she leaned against the Challenger, still lingered in Elena's thoughts. It was strange, almost haunting, how a young woman she had never met seemed to fill the air of the shop. Every creak of the old car felt like Lily's presence pressing closer, as if the girl's spirit had been waiting all this time for someone to listen. Rex shifted beside her, ears flicking. The German shepherd had been restless since sunrise, pacing between the doorway and the Challenger as though guarding something unseen. His coat caught the light in streaks of amber and black, and his scar along the flank twitched as his muscles tensed. He was not a dog prone to anxiety. Years of service had trained him into calm vigilance. So, when he suddenly trotted over to the passenger side of the Challenger and pressed his nose against the floor mat, Elena paid attention. "What is it, boy?" she asked, wiping her hands on the orange fabric of her mechanic's uniform. Rex pawed once, twice at the edge of the carpet. His claws scraped the frayed material, then he looked back at her, ears pricked, a quiet whine escaping his throat. Elena crouched beside him, her brow furrowing. She slid her gloved hands beneath the mat, tugging at the brittle edges. The carpet lifted with a groan of old adhesive, releasing a smell of mildew and dust. Beneath the padding, something metallic clinked faintly. Her pulse quickened. She pried further until her fingers caught on the corner of a small tin box, its surface dulled with age and wrapped in layers of black electrical tape. She pulled it free, coughing as a puff of trapped dust escaped. The box was heavier than it looked. Elena sat back on her heels, the box balanced in her palms. Rex sniffed it, then sat expectantly, as if he knew the weight of its contents was more than metal. For a moment, Elena simply stared, hesitating. This was no ordinary stash of junk. This was deliberate. Someone had hidden it here, most likely Lily herself. She fetched a utility knife from her workbench, the blade glinting under the fluorescent hum of the overhead light. Carefully, she sliced through the brittle tape until the lid sprang loose. Inside lay a collection of items arranged with surprising care. On top rested a small silver pendant of St. Christopher, patron saint of travelers. The metal was tarnished, but when she held it up, the etched figure still caught the light. She imagined Lily wearing it on a chain during long drives, perhaps clutching it before starting the Challenger, believing in its protection. Elena's chest tightened. Soldiers, too, carried talismans into war, and she remembered her own dog tags pressing against her skin in moments of fear. Beneath the pendant lay a folded sheaf of papers, hand-drawn diagrams marked Stage 3, Street Track Setup. The sketches detailed modifications beyond basic restoration, upgraded suspension geometry, a tuned carburetor, a custom exhaust design. The handwriting was sharp, confident, notes scribbled in the margins. Test at 120 mph. Balance weight for cornering. Dad says this is ambitious, but I want it. Elena traced the lines with her finger, impressed by the technical understanding. Lily hadn't just been a hobbyist. She had been serious, maybe even visionary. At the bottom of the box was a bundle of saving certificates, the paper crisp despite their age. Elena unfolded them, her eyes widening at the total, $15,000. She let out a low whistle. That was not pocket change for a 20-year-old. Lily must have saved tirelessly, perhaps working long shifts or sacrificing everything else for this dream. Finally, tucked beneath the certificates, a letter folded into thirds, the edges yellowed and smudged. Elena unfolded it carefully, her hands trembling slightly. The handwriting was the same neat cursive she had seen on the receipts Frank gave her. "To whoever finds this," the letter began, "if you're reading it, then the Challenger is in your hands. She's not easy, she's not perfect, but she has a soul, Please don't just restore her to factory specs. Build her the way you dream, not the way the manual tells you. This car saved me once. My dad and I didn't always know how to talk, but we could always turn a wrench together. Building this Challenger taught me patience, grit, and love. If you carry her forward, do it with your heart. That's all I ask. Lily Doyle. Elena let the letter rest on her lap. Her throat was dry. She felt as though Lily had spoken directly to her across the years, urging her not just to fix the car, but to inhabit the dream that had been left unfinished. Rex nuzzled her arm gently, grounding her back in the moment. Later that afternoon, Frank returned. His figure darkened the garage doorway, shoulders hunched as if bracing against the past he had dared to face again. Elena rose to meet him, holding the tin box. His eyes flicked to it, and he froze. "I found this under the passenger seat," Elena said softly, Frank's face drained of color, his weathered hands trembling as he reached out. He lifted the pendant first, staring at it until his lips pressed into a thin line. His gray eyes watered, and for a long moment he couldn't speak. "I thought it was gone," he whispered finally. "That necklace. She wore it every time she drove. When she died, I searched the car. I didn't find it. I thought maybe it was lost at the crash." Elena passed him the diagrams and certificates. His fingers shook as he traced the notes. "She worked at 2 jobs," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "One at the diner in town, one at a parts store. I never understood how she managed to save so much. She told me once she was building a future, but she never let me see how far she'd gone." When Elena unfolded the letter and read it aloud, Frank pressed a hand over his mouth, tears cutting lines through the dust on his face. He sank onto the stool by the wall, staring at the floor, shoulders shaking. For a man who had carried grief silently for decades, the release was overwhelming. Elena placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "She meant for someone to find it," she said. "She meant for this car to live again, not as it was, but as it could be. Maybe that someone is me. Maybe it's us." Frank nodded weakly, clutching the pendant like it was the last piece of his daughter he could hold. "If you do this," he said hoarsely, "then she'll ride again. And maybe I'll hear her laughter in the engine." The garage fell into quiet again, but it was no longer empty silence. Between the 3 of them, Elena, Frank, and Rex, something unspoken passed, a recognition that the Challenger was more than a project. It was a promise, sealed by the faith of a young woman gone too soon and carried now by those who refused to let her dream die. The next week dawned with the scent of oil and fresh determination. Elena Morales approached the Challenger like she once approached an operation briefing. Calm, focused, prepared to break a complex mission into precise steps. The envelope of Lily's dreams lay open on her workbench, sketches and notes pinned above the pegboard like battle maps. Each line, each margin scribble became an order to follow. She would not rush. Discipline was her trade, and just as combat had been won inch by inch, so too would this resurrection. She started with the frame, stripping away what decades of neglect had corroded. Rusted bolts shrieked under the torque wrench. Sparks flew as she cut through frozen joints, and by evening her arms burned as though she had carried a rucksack for miles. Rex shadowed her every movement. When sparks rained, he lay flat under the workbench, head resting on his paws, ears flicking as if judging the steadiness of her work. When she cursed at a stripped screw, he would rise and push his muzzle against her knee as if reminding her to breathe. He was the sergeant now, she the private, each correction silent but understood. Word of the project spread through Glenfield faster than she expected. Old towns had quick tongues and quicker curiosity. By the fourth day, a knock came at the garage. A tall man entered, moving with the slow deliberation of age, but with the sturdy build of someone who had once wielded heavy tools. His hair was snow white, his beard trimmed short but uneven, and a pair of steel-rimmed glasses perched on a nose flattened from years of shop accidents. His eyes, pale blue, carried the patience of a teacher who had seen hundreds of boys and girls learn to hold a wrench for the first time. He introduced himself as Harold Parker, retired shop teacher from the high school. Once, decades earlier, he had taught auto mechanics in a room filled with the smell of acetylene and chalk dust. Arthritis had stiffened his hands now, the knuckles swollen, but his mind was sharp. "Heard you're bringing the old Dodge back," he said, leaning against the doorway with a grin half hidden in his beard. "Couldn't resist seeing if you knew your way around suspension geometry." Elena raised an eyebrow, wiping grease across her cheek. "I know my way, but I wouldn't mind someone checking my math." Parker chuckled, the sound gravelly but warm. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing arms still corded with sinew, and soon he was at her side, guiding her through the delicate angles of control arms and sway bars. He spoke like a man revisiting a long-lost love, the technical language rolling off his tongue, and Elena found herself absorbing his wisdom with surprising ease. By the weekend, another figure appeared. She was slight, barely 17, with a wiry frame that spoke of nervous energy. Her black hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, strands constantly slipping over her forehead. She wore a faded hoodie, jeans frayed at the knees, and scuffed sneakers that had clearly seen too many bus rides. Her eyes, however, were sharp and hungry, the kind of gaze that devoured every detail of the garage. She introduced herself timidly as Maya Sanchez, a high school junior who had heard from her uncle, Carl, the hauler, that a veteran was restoring a Challenger. "I want to learn," she blurted out before Elena could respond. Her voice trembled but carried a spark of stubbornness. "Cars they make sense to me. School doesn't, but engines, they're honest. Can I help?" Elena studied her. Maya's hands were ink-stained, not yet calloused, but they twitched with eagerness. Elena recognized that look, the desperation of someone needing a place to belong. She remembered herself at 16, begging her father to let her tear down an alternator. With a sigh, Elena handed her a rag. "You can start by cleaning those valve covers. If you're still here by sundown, maybe I'll trust you with a wrench." Maya grinned so wide it lit her whole face. She dropped to her knees, scrubbing metal with fierce determination, smearing her hoodie in oil within minutes. Rex observed her with suspicion at first, nose sniffing her shoes, but by evening he curled near her work spot, granting her the same watchful approval he gave Elena. The trio worked long hours, and still the Challenger fought them at every step. The V8 small block, seized from decades of silence, resisted like a stubborn soldier refusing to march. Elena and Parker dismantled it piece by piece, their dialogue alternating between quiet technical calculations and bursts of laughter at Maya's endless questions. Why does it matter if the pistons are balanced? What happens if we don't hone the cylinders? Parker answered with patience, while Elena snapped terse explanations that grew softer with each day. On the seventh day, while sunlight slanted golden through the garage windows, a visitor arrived unannounced. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a simple black shirt tucked into slacks, his clerical collar stark against the worn fabric. His hair was salt and pepper, combed neatly, though sweat beaded at his temples from the walk. His face carried both solemnity and a quiet humor that softened his stern frame. He introduced himself as Deacon Paul Harris, the town's preacher, though he quickly raised a hand before Elena could object. "Don't worry, I'm not here to bless the car," he said, with a grin that revealed surprisingly boyish dimples. "I rebuilt a Chevelle when I was younger. Thought maybe my polishing days weren't done yet." To prove his point, he picked up a rag and attacked the Challenger's battered chrome pieces with vigor, humming old hymns under his breath. Maya giggled at the incongruity. A preacher elbow-deep in grease, and even Elena cracked a smile. It was strange, but comforting. People were drawn not only to the car, but to the act of building, something greater than themselves. As the days blended, the garage became more than a workspace. It turned into a gathering place, the clang of wrenches and the scent of gasoline mixing with laughter, the occasional argument, and Rex's steady presence. At times, Elena stood back, arms crossed, and simply watched. The soldier in her measured their productivity, but the woman in her marveled at the community forming around Lily's dream. She realized she had not felt this kind of belonging since before the war. One evening, after Parker had gone home and Maya had been sent off with grease on her face and pride in her chest, Elena lingered by the Chalisonen. The frame gleamed where rust had once eaten through, the new suspension sat ready, and the bare bones of the engine lay waiting for life. Rex lay stretched under the bay light, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Elena touched the St. Christopher pendant now hanging on a hook near her bench, then whispered, "We're moving forward, Lily. Piece by piece, we're bringing you back." And in the stillness, she thought she heard the faintest echo of laughter. Young, bright, carried through time like the hum of an idling engine waiting to roar again. The sun over Glenfield was relentless, burning through the thin veil of clouds and turning the garage's corrugated tin roof into a skillet. Inside, Elena Morales peeled off her gloves and stood back from the Challenger, its body stripped and smoothed to bare steel. Every dent had been hammered true, every scar sanded down with patient hands, and for the first time in decades, the car no longer looked like a carcass, but like a canvas awaiting color. Sweat streaked her temples, darkening her short brown hair, and her mechanic's uniform, once bright orange, was now stained with streaks of primer dust. She had endured worse heat in the desert, worse exhaustion under fire, but this task required a different kind of endurance, one built on precision rather than survival. Harold Parker leaned against the workbench, squinting at the body panels with a practiced eye. His thick white beard and wrinkled brow gave him the look of a sage who had seen countless machines reborn. "You've done your prep right," he said, voice steady and approving. "Paint won't lie. If you'd cut corners, she'd show every flaw." He adjusted his glasses, watching as sunlight caught the gleam of freshly sanded steel. Maya Sanchez was perched on a stool, her hoodie sleeves rolled up, smudges of gray primer on her cheeks. She had been tasked with masking off trim and windows with strips of blue tape, her small fingers deft and quick. She hummed under her breath, a nervous habit, but her eyes never left the details. "What color is it going to be?" she asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Elena pointed to the folder pinned above the bench, Lily's sketch still taped in place. "Lily red," she said. "Metallic cherry, darkened 30%. Her words, not mine." Deacon Paul Harris, sleeves rolled, stepped forward carrying a spray gun, his clerical collar replaced with a plain black t-shirt. The preacher's broad shoulders filled the garage, but his grin softened his presence. "If we're painting in memory of a dream," he said, "then let's do it right." He handed the gun to Elena like it was a sacred relic. The booth had been improvised. Plastic sheets stretched from the ceiling, a fan rigged with filters at the back. Elena pulled the respirator over her face, adjusted the nozzle, and with a steady hand began laying down the first coat. The sound hissed, steady and soft, like rain falling on steel. With each pass, the Challenger transformed. Bare metal surrendered to color, deep, haunting, and alive. The shade shimmered between crimson and black cherry under the lights, not merely red but something richer, something with weight. Rex sat just beyond the taped plastic, eyes fixed on her, tail thumping once against the floor as though he too approved. Elena moved with slow discipline, overlapping strokes, ensuring no runs, no streaks. Hours passed, coat upon coat, until finally she lowered the gun and stepped back. The Challenger glowed. It was no longer a relic, it was a resurrection. The next stage came harder. With the engine rebuilt and fitted, it was time to put the beast to the test. The borrowed dyno machine, a massive contraption of rollers and gauges, took up most of the bay. It had been lent to her by Jim Keegan, a wiry man in his late 50s who owned a towing yard on the other side of town. His thinning blonde hair clung stubbornly to his scalp, and his sun-leathered skin made him look perpetually tired. But he was known for generosity with fellow gearheads. "She'll fight you," he warned as he tightened the last strap around the Challenger's frame. "Engines like this, after sleeping so long, they don't wake up gentle." The first ignition thundered through the garage. The small block V8 roared, coughing black smoke before settling into a deep growl. Maya clapped her hands over her ears, her eyes wide with both fear and awe. Parker leaned close to the console, reading gauges, while Deacon Paul murmured something that could have been either a prayer or a tune from his youth. Elena's hands gripped the wheel inside the car, her chest tight with anticipation. At first, the readings were steady, but as the throttle pushed higher, the temperature gauge spiked. The Challenger shuddered, coughing again. Steam hissed from under the hood. "Kill it!" Parker shouted, and Elena cut the ignition instantly. Silence returned, broken only by the sharp hiss of coolant dripping onto hot steel. Elena swung out of the driver's seat, jaw set. She popped the hood. The radiator's neck had cracked, sending coolant spraying across the block. Maya bit her lip, worry clouding her face. "Did we break it?" she asked. "No," Elena replied, her tone clipped but calm. "It broke on its own. Our job is to fix it." She studied the steaming mess with the sharp eyes of a soldier scanning a battlefield. "This isn't a setback, it's intelligence. We isolate the problem, eliminate the weakness, rebuild stronger." For 3 nights she worked long after the others had gone home. Parker left her technical manuals, Maya left notes taped to the bench with little doodles of cars, and Deacon Paul brought thermoses of coffee he swore were blessed by patience itself. Rex stayed, always. When Elena grew frustrated, slamming a wrench down or cursing at a stubborn fitting, Rex would nudge her elbow, his amber eyes unwavering. She found herself speaking aloud to him, half in jest, half in desperate need of reassurance. "You'd have made a fine sergeant, Rex, always keeping me on task." On the 4th night, with the new radiator installed, hoses tightened, and a prayer muttered under her breath, she tried again. The Challenger roared awake. The gauges held steady this time, the coolant line cool, the oil pressure strong. She eased the throttle. The dyno trembled as the wheels spun, the deep growl rising into a howl. Parker, half asleep in a chair, bolted upright. At the sound, and checked the readouts. "She's holding," he called out, disbelief in his voice. Elena let out a long breath, a grin cracking her face for the first time in weeks. Rex padded forward, placed his head gently on the open driver's door, and looked up at her. She laughed, reaching down to ruffle his fur. "We made it through, Sergeant Rex," she said, her voice breaking into something lighter than it had been in years. "We passed the trial." For the first time, the garage didn't just echo with the sound of machines. It pulsed with triumph, with the unmistakable rhythm of life returning to something that had once been lost. The town square of Glenfield came alive under the sweep of a golden autumn sun, banners strung between lampposts, their fabric snapping gently in the crisp breeze. The Veterans and Classic Car Day was the kind of small-town festival that stitched generations together. Flags waving, children perched on their fathers' shoulders, food stalls serving barbecue smoke into the air, and an old brass band warming up in the gazebo. For Elena Morales, this was the first time in years she allowed herself to stand among a crowd without the weight of uniform or rifle. Yet her posture still betrayed her discipline. Straight back, measured stride, eyes scanning instinctively. She wore her orange mechanic's coverall rolled at the sleeves, polished just enough to look presentable, and carried herself with the quiet pride of someone who had survived war and found another battle worth fighting. Beside her, Rex trotted with ears high, his black and tan coat gleaming after a rare, thorough brushing. Children rushed to pet him, and though he tolerated their hands with patience, his amber eyes never strayed far from Elena. At the heart of the square gleamed the Dodge Challenger. The lily-red paint shimmered like liquid fire, the metallic cherry glow catching every beam of sunlight. The polished chrome reflected the faces leaning close in awe, and the deep V8 engine under its hood promised thunder. Around the car, townsfolk gathered with the reverence usually reserved for church altars. Elena wiped a fingerprint off the fender with her rag, a small smile curving her lips as she overheard whispers. "That's the Morales woman's project. Did you hear it belonged to Doyle's girl?" Frank Doyle emerged from the crowd slowly, his figure stooped but steady. He had shaved that morning, the gray stubble trimmed close to his weathered jawline. He wore his brown leather jacket, a plaid shirt beneath, and in his eyes flickered a mixture of pride and sorrow. He stopped short when the Challenger came into full view. For a moment he stood silent, his breathing shallow, hands trembling at his sides. The car was no longer the rusted corpse he had left behind the barn. It stood reborn, alive, like a memory polished back into the present. Elena met his gaze. "She's ready," she said softly. Frank's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He reached out, fingers brushing the driver's side handle, and pulled it open. The interior, restored with black leather stitched by Parker's steady hands and Maya's careful threading, smelled of newness and faint gasoline. He lowered himself into the seat slowly, as though afraid it might vanish. His hands gripped the wheel, calloused fingers trembling against the smooth leather. He looked up at Elena, standing at the open door, and whispered, "I never thought I'd sit here again." Elena nodded. "Turn the key, Frank." He did. The engine roared to life with a deep growl that rattled windows along the square. The crowd gasped, then applauded, and children covered their ears with laughter. Frank's face broke into something that hadn't touched him in years, a smile that reached his eyes. His lips quivered as though forming a prayer. "It's her heartbeat," he murmured. "I can hear Lily in it." Elena slipped into the passenger seat, Rex climbing into the back, his paws firm on the seat as though ready for patrol. Frank eased the Challenger forward, the gears shifting smoothly, the power beneath the hood surging steady and strong. The square opened into the main street, and as they rolled through, townsfolk cheered and waved flags. Elena rested her elbow against the window frame, watching Frank with quiet respect. For once, the weight of grief seemed lighter on his shoulders. They circled 2 blocks before Frank guided the car out toward the open road, a narrow stretch lined with maples turning gold. The tires hummed against asphalt, the V8's low growl carrying through the crisp air. Frank's grip on the wheel steadied, his back straightened, and for a brief stretch of road he was no longer an aging man weighed down by memory, but a father sharing a ride with his daughter again. He slowed near the edge of the town, pulled over beneath the canopy of leaves, and let the engine idle. He turned to Elena, eyes bright with tears that finally fell unchecked. "She would have loved what you've done. You gave her dream the chance I couldn't." Elena's chest tightened. She placed her hand over his weathered knuckles, still gripping the wheel. "We both gave her this. You kept her dream safe all those years. I just helped bring it back." Rex nosed forward between the seats, resting his chin on Frank's shoulder as if offering his silent agreement. Frank let out a shaky laugh, reaching up to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Even the sergeant approves." They returned to the square, where the Challenger once again became the centerpiece of admiration. Amid the crowd was Howard Lane, a middle-aged man with a camera slung across his chest. He was in his early 40s, average build with sandy hair thinning at the crown, a square jaw covered in neatly kept stubble, and a pair of keen green eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Howard was a Gulf War veteran himself, though his limp and the cane he leaned on were reminders of shrapnel that had cut his service short. Photography had become his second mission, a way to capture resilience where words failed. He had spent years documenting veterans' lives, turning his work into features for small-town papers and regional magazines. Howard raised his camera, snapping shots as Frank stepped out of the car, leaning against the door with a proud but fragile smile. Elena and Rex stood beside him, framed against the gleam of the Challenger. Howard lowered the lens and introduced himself with a firm handshake. "Name's Howard Lane. I cover stories for Classic Wheels Journal. This," he gestured at the car, the people surrounding it, the father with tears drying on his cheeks. "This is what I call a legacy build. May I run it?" Elena hesitated, unused to the attention, but Frank nodded. "Tell it true," he said simply. "Tell them about my Lily." Howard's expression softened. "I promise." Weeks later, the issue arrived. Glossy pages filled with photos of the lily-red Challenger under Glenfield's sun, Frank's hand on the hood, Elena's grease-stained coverall, and tired but determined eyes, Rex sitting like a sentinel. The article, titled "Legacy Builds, the Dream That Lived Again," spread far beyond Glenfield. Letters poured in from readers, veterans who had abandoned projects of their own, daughters who remembered working on cars with their fathers, families who saw themselves mirrored in Lily's story. But in that moment, on that autumn afternoon in Glenfield, it was enough for Frank Doyle to sit behind the wheel once more. Enough for Elena Morales to see the weight in his eyes lighten, and enough for Rex to rest, content that his pack was whole again, even if just for a ride around the block. Winter loosened its grip on Glenfield with the slow patience of the South. By early spring, blossoms pushed against the chill, and the garage on Oak Hollow Avenue was no longer just a repair shop. Elena Morales had turned it into something larger, something she called Wrench and Rise. A banner painted by Maya in bold black letters hung over the open bay door. Beneath it, the smell of grease mingled with the laughter of voices that didn't used to belong in a mechanic's space. The program had started simple. Elena teaching a handful of women how to change their own oil, how to rotate tires, how to read a dipstick without relying on someone else. But word spread fast, and soon teenagers, veterans, and even widowed retirees began showing up. The idea wasn't only about engines. It was about confidence, the kind that came from turning a stubborn bolt until it yielded, from making something run when the world told you that you couldn't. On a Saturday morning, the garage was alive with motion. Elena stood at the center, still in her orange mechanic's uniform with sleeves rolled, her hands black with grease, but her voice clear and instructive. Around her were 6 students. Among them was Sarah Whitaker, a widowed nurse in her 50s. She was tall and lean, her strawberry blonde hair streaked with silver, her pale skin lined by years of night shifts and quiet sacrifices. Sarah's hands trembled at first when she held a wrench, but Elena's calm instructions steadied her, and by noon she was smiling shyly as she checked the pressure on her tires. Another student was Darnell Brooks, a 30-year-old veteran recently discharged after an IED blast had left his left leg braced with titanium. He was broad-shouldered, skin dark as walnut, his beard thick and trimmed close to his square jaw. At first, his eyes carried suspicion, the guarded look of a man who had lost too many comrades to trust easily. But as he leaned over an engine block with Maya explaining torque patterns, he laughed, short, rusty, but genuine. It was the first time Elena had seen him shed the stiffness of military habit. Maya herself had blossomed. The girl who once cleaned valve covers now wore a faded shop apron, hair tied back neatly, her movements growing more confident each day. She had discovered not only mechanical skill, but a sense of belonging she never found at school. Elena watched her explain brake pad wear to a younger boy, her voice clear, her hands precise, and felt a strange swell of pride, as though she were passing down not just knowledge, but a lineage. Rex wandered through it all like a supervisor, tail swishing lazily. He nosed a socket rolling across the floor back toward a group, barked once when a jack wasn't locked securely, and stretched under the Challenger as if making sure no detail escaped notice. The dog was no longer just Elena's partner. He was the shop's unspoken guardian, adored by every student who knelt to scratch his ears. Later, that afternoon, Frank Doyle arrived. He looked older than he had during the parade, but steadier, too. His grief carried differently now, less like a burden, more like a companion he had learned to walk with. He carried a small box under his arm, wrapped in a cloth. Elena wiped her hands and greeted him with a nod, sensing the weight of the visit. "I came to return something," she said quietly, pulling the St. Christopher pendant from her coverall pocket. She had kept it safe these months, wearing it only once during the first test drive, but now she pressed it into Frank's palm. His hand closed around it, knuckles white, tears brightening his gray eyes. "She wore this every time she drove," he whispered. His shoulders shook once, and then steadied. "You've brought her back to me." Elena placed a hand on his shoulder. "No," she said firmly, "I only carried it until you were ready. Now it's home again." Together they stepped into the shop, where Lily's framed letter hung above the main bench. Its words, "Don't just restore her to factory. Build her the way you dream," had become the garage's compass. Every new student looked up at it on their first day. Some touched the glass lightly, as if Lily herself were blessing their work. The Challenger, parked proudly in the bay, had become more than a car. It was the town's monument. It led the Crosstown Veterans Parade, carrying 3 elders who had fought in Korea, their medals catching sunlight as the V8's rumble rolled down Main Street. It appeared at Maya's high school graduation, draped in ribbons, carrying her and her classmates through the square. Each time the engine started, it carried not just power, but memory, an unbroken thread tying Lily's dream to the present. As evening fell, the day's lessons ended, the laughter faded, and the shop grew quiet. Elena sat on the step of the bay door, her arms resting on her knees. Rex lay beside her, muzzle pressed to her boot, his ears relaxed. Frank sat too, lowering himself carefully, the pendant still clutched in his hand. Before them, the Challenger gleamed under the fading sun, its red surface catching the last light of day. Elena's gaze softened. She whispered, almost to herself, this wasn't just about restoring a car, it was about keeping a promise. The Challenger seemed to answer with the slow tick of cooling metal, its engine silent but alive with memory. And as the horizon swallowed the last of the light, Elena felt the future open like an unmarked road, wide and waiting. Sometimes a car is more than steel, more than bolts and wheels. It becomes a vessel of memory, a bridge between generations, a whisper of love that refuses to fade. In the story of Elena, Frank, Lily, and Rex, we see not just the restoration of a Dodge Challenger, but the restoration of faith, that what is broken can live again, and what is lost can still speak to us. Perhaps this is the quiet miracle of life, that God places small signs in our path, an old pendant, a forgotten letter, a loyal dog, so that we remember His promise that nothing good is ever truly gone. Every turn of the wrench, every rumble of the engine, becomes a reminder that grace works not only in churches or grand moments, but in garages, in friendships, in the everyday struggles where hope is tested. So, as you go back to your own daily road, whether it's in a busy city or a quiet town, carry this truth with you. There is always redemption waiting under the rust, always light beneath the dust. May God bless you and your family, keep your dreams alive, and guide your hands in every challenge you face. If this story touched your heart, please share it with a friend, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of hope, healing, and second chances. Together, let's keep these stories alive, because sometimes the greatest miracle is simply believing.